Hello, I'm Shane in Sweden, and this is my series of videos on how to build an intrusion detection system using C# and Visual Studio. And as always, if you want to follow along with the coding, then just download the source code from the link in the notes under the video, and you can follow along and do the same coding as I'm doing in this video. In the last video, we were looking at how we would use a reporter with a repository, and we got as far as creating our Entity Frameworks repository, and now we want to go further and use our Entity Frameworks repository in our reporter. So we are back to reporter test here. We're going to create a new reporter test. Now I'm just going to rename this test because we didn't actually create a simple reporter. We created, I guess, a substituted reporter, virtual reporter. Now we will actually create a simple reporter, and this will be a simple reporter class, I think. Let's call it database reporter, which is a reporter that reports to a database. This is equal to a new database reporter. And into this database reporter we're going to insert, because we could have lots of different databases, we could have even no SQL databases. So into this we're going to send in some sort of IDS. Again, we want to reduce the scope of our dependency on volatile parts of our system that are going to change. So we create a new interface here. Entity Frameworks ReportAgent. So let's create these classes first. We need to implement the ReportAgent method. But if you remember rightly, in the last test we have gone a bit further now. We're not reporting a packet and capture time and a sensor ID. We're actually reporting network Eventargs, which is sitting here in our sharp pcap information class. I think we want to extract that to its own class, network Eventargs. And this will be a good vehicle for our reporting. So if we go back to our report tests, we want to use the network Eventargs. Now this doesn't exist yet, so we want to add that into our iReporter interface. In fact, let's just refactor. Let's get rid of the old method. Now we've got to change our test here. So the old class was this report packet. Now we want to report, we can just set that to null. Now we still haven't implemented our IDS, so that's the next bit here. And in this report IDS, we're going to extract that as well to its own class and move that into our interfaces. Delete the old version. Actually, we will move this not to Tyranids, we'll move this IDS to our data class, our data project. And in this we will have repository methods. So we will have save alert, and read alert. And in this we will use a network Eventarg. And here we've got a class that we actually need in our data classes. We need it in our Tyranids class, and we need it in our data tests. So it's needed everywhere. So what we want to do is create a new project. Class library, which we will call tyranids.common. And it would be actually useful to put some of these things into our common class, for example, our interfaces. We can delete that from there. And then we can move the IDS back to our interface and remove it from there. Now these all need to have a new namespace. And then if we just build, we're going to have to clean up a bit here. This should be network event. Network Eventargs we also want to move to the common class. And we'll delete it from here. So this will also be tyranids.common. Well, we'll have different methods, but maybe perhaps to read all alerts. We can leave that for the moment. So at the moment we just want to see if we can persist our method. So the save alert is the main important method we're going to use. So we've got some cleanup to do here after refactoring. Right, we're in our report tests here, and I'm guessing this needs to have a reference to our common. That looks better. And Tyranids also needs a reference, add a reference to our common. And data even needs to add a reference to our common. So that should reduce our errors. We don't need the namespace interface because it lies in the common. And this is part of our sensor, which we'll have to get back to. But at the moment, it's got one parameter in there. We just want to check that this is working. Okay, we've got one error left. So let's get into that. Okay, we're now down to not having an Entity Frameworks data agent, which we want to create. So let's create that new class. Let's implement the members and extract. Yes, let's rename it first and then move it second. So it's now in our test, but actually it should be in the data project. So let's move it there and delete from here. And this should be tyranids.data. Now I just want to check, I noticed that we were getting some double namespaces. So I have a feeling that we've got Tyran IDS, but I'm not sure if we're following that for all our classes. Tyran IDS, Tyran IDS. Tyran IDS looks good so far. Okay, we just need to bear in mind that there was some sort of double namespace, and that probably means that we've got different sorts of namespaces. We can do a quick search for all the namespaces we have. There. So if we search for this, an even match case, these should all be Tyran IDS. Rebuild. Okay, we've rebuilt everything. So let's just go to our test tools. And let's rerun all our tests just to make sure we haven't damaged anything. And we can see that everything's running except for one test which is failing, our simple reporter. And that's complaining that our method has not been implemented. And if we go into our test, go down to report captured, we come to our simple reporter and we can see that it actually hasn't been implemented. So that's not surprising, we get a not implemented exception. But we're going to change this test around anyway. We're not going to use the end substitution here. We're actually going to do another type of test which is called integration test, where we go down, test down through our different layers. In this case we're going to test the connection between our test layer obviously, but even down to the data layer and the common objects. So we have our test pause. That'll give us time, if you remember rightly, for when we're using our test capture device, it will generate an event which we can then capture. But in this case we're going to report it down to the database. So we're going to have to use our transaction scope again here. And I guess again we're in the situation where we need to add system transactions. And inside that scope, we then add our tests and run our await pause. And And we will even do our asserts inside the transaction scope, because we're going to go all the way down to the database layer, and we want to make sure that any changes we make are not permanent. So here the reporter, which is a database reporter. So when we create our sensor, we've created our sensor with a database reporter. It's going to receive the event and write down to the database, persist. And so afterwards we want to assert that the data exists in the database. And so here we're going to pull out the data. And we don't have methods, so we're going to make a method where we read an alert based on its GUID. No, based on the GUID of the sensor where we read the latest alert. And here we're going to read the latest alert using our sensor, or using our information source.id. We need some way here to test. We need some way to know which message we actually captured, persisted. Actually, delete all that. Whenever we've persisted the data, well, then we should have some data. We should have some alerts in the database. So let's create a method called countAlerts. And this method doesn't exist, so we need to implement it. And if we go to our data agent, we can assume it's not implementing these methods yet, so we need to fix that. So here we're going to be using our data model. So using our alert entities, we can create a new entity. Again, we don't need to add the alert ID. Captured we can leave as null for the moment. Created, we'll set the datetime.now. Data source ID is equal to args data source.id. Destination port is equal to args destination port. Source port is equal to args source port. Destination IP is equal to args.destination IP address. Source IP is equal to args.source IP address. Payload is equal to args.payload text. And that should be good enough. But we're getting an error here. Why are we getting an error? Convert string to system nullable int. Right. So destination port should be an integer. And source port should also be an integer. And let's change that here. We've probably broken something now. So that's looking good. We've added our alerts to the entities. We can entities save change. So we take away the string conversion because these port values are now integer. That's not an integer, and this is a string. But we can create that as an integer. source port as well should be an integer. Let's just set that, initialize them to 0, so we can avoid that initialized error. Okay, so let's go back to our test. Now that we've made some changes, we need to check that our tests are running. And everything's still green except for the tests we're working on, which is great. So here we are fetching the number of alerts. And if we go back to our Entity Frame data agents, we've now implemented the persisting the alerts, but we haven't implemented the counting alerts. So let's just use our context here. And we're just going to return entities.alerts count. So, and then when we come back to our reporter test, we can assert it is true that the number of alerts is greater than 0. And then the transaction will roll back. We're using our test capture device, which we know as soon as we start it, sensor, it will generate an event which we'll capture. Capture event we will persist report. This time we're using a database reporter, which will report it down to our Entity Frameworks SQL Server database. After waiting the sufficient number of time for this to happen, we will go in and count the number of alerts in our database, and hopefully it'll be greater than 0. If so, then our test is passed. So if we go to our test windows and we rerun our test, an immediate failure. So we're getting a method not implemented. I assume it's our problem is our database reporter. Let's go to database reporter. Okay, our database reporter is not doing anything at the moment, so let's just create a data agent. We'll set that. And when we report the packet capture, we just need to call on our agent, save the alert using the args. Okay, that might work a bit better. So if we run our selected tests again. Okay, system invalid operation exception. Transaction scope must be removed from the same thread that it was created in. I apologize for the Swedish message there. If we look at our transaction scope, why did this work before? Why is it failing now? Well, the reason is because we're sitting with asynchronous methods. We need to adapt our transaction so that it can handle an asynchronous situation. So we need to enable our transaction so that it can handle thread continuations, and we do that with the new transaction async flow option. So we enable async operations within our transaction. Now if we run our selected tests again, hopefully we'll get a better result. At least we'll remove that error. Okay, we're still getting a fail on the test, but our error changes failed. We're saying no connection string named alerts entities was found in the application config file. So we had that problem before. As you remember, we needed to copy the Entity Frameworks data from our app config. And I'm guessing in our report tests, where this is running from, we do not have that information. And in fact, we don't even have an app config. So let's just add an application configuration. And then inside that, we can add our Entity Frameworks information. And then if we rerun our test. Now while this test is running, I don't personally think it's a great idea to have connection string information in the application config file. There are other ways of handling it, but in our simple project here, it's good enough for a proof of concept type project. So we're still getting error. Okay, here we couldn't load the Entity Framework Provider type, and I'm guessing that we're missing some sort of reference. I see we don't have any reference to Entity Frameworks. So if we go back to our management console and we go to our Turnet tests project, and here we can install package. Which will hopefully give us the references we need now to Entity Framework and Entity Framework SQL Server. If we rerun our test. Okay, now we can see everything's running at least, but we're still getting a failure on our test. Just delete that file, it's not needed. Okay, we fetched the number of alerts. So let's just debug our test and see what's happening here. Our database reporter. Let's just check and see if we're actually persisting any of our data. So let's debug our test. So we generate our packet. We've come in on the database reporter, we're saving. Right, so we've got an exception here. Data is fine, args is null. So if we go to our call stack, so the report package captured was null. So whatever generated the event is generating an event. And here it is, or we actually sending a null packet. So when we run our get next message method, what we really want to be returning now is a network events arg, since that's what we want to report. So we've got to look at it in our report test. What type of capture device are we? It's a test capture device. So if we go to our sensor, it uses a sharp PCAP information source. And on packet arrival, so it adds with the payload text, and that's what we fetch. That's just the text, but really what we want to do is add network event args. So we want to change the method to network events to use network event args. And this should be a list of network event args. And we can remove that old method. If we go back to here, add network information message, this should be now a network event args. And get next message should return a network event args. Here we're going to add the whole network arguments instead of just adding the text. And now we're not implementing the iActive. Let's see what we're missing here. Okay, so if we go to sharp PCAP, it doesn't implement get next message. And here's the problem. We have a string, so we want a network. And we need to change this buffer now to a network event args buffer. So we're going to add create substitutes for and we will create these with string.empty 0 string.empty 0 string.empty. They timed it now. We've got a grid, so let's do a grid.new grid. So we've got net Eventargs here we can use. This, we can use the same one again and the same one again. And here we've got network Eventargs. Now we're going to match on message.payload text instead. And here we can report the whole message. And here we've got a similar problem there to what we had there. Create and here we've got a similar problem. But we're testing here on a hacking attempt, so we've got to be a bit more careful. Here the payload should not be string.empty, it should be hacking attempt. And we'll create with the type hello and a third. Also type hello. And we're going to add these three instead of the simple text versions we had before. And here we have something similar. Except that we have user admin. Two and three. Wait, little mistake. Didn't matter that there was text. So now it has three messages and we process one, which goes down to two. So if we run our selected test, now it's green. And let's run all our selected tests. And all our tests are green. If we go back to our reporter test, now we're doing a real integration test because we're actually creating a database reporter, which inside our transaction, we're using our test capture device, which generates a network event, which we capture and we persist down to the database. And we're checking here that the number of alerts in the database is more than one, that we've actually reported that packet. So this test is going all the way down to the database and back up again. And if we check the number of rows in the database, again you can see the tests are leaving it completely clear. Okay, so we've got a reporting agent that uses an Entity Frameworks data repository, and so we're pretty much created and tested all of our components, our sensors, our information sources, our reporting agents. We're almost ready to build a working system and give it a try. But before we do that, we may want to look at one more component, and that's an analysis center. But for this particular video, I think we've come quite far, and so I think we'll leave it here. Thank you very much,